political science, the term social engineering refers to top-down efforts to influence particular attitudes and social behaviors on a large scale. Social engineering has a strong association with collectivism, conformism, communism, and totalitarianism. It was adopted by the social reformers involved in the American eugenics movement during the Progressive Era, which also brought compulsory schooling to America. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union used social engineering to replace the old social frameworks of the Russian Empire with a new Soviet culture and to develop what was known as the New Soviet Person, which was a theoretical concept describing a citizen with specific qualities that were in keeping with current affairs and industrial trends. Qualities which tended to be in the orbit of obedience, conformity, open-mindedness, collectivism, and being unencumbered by traditions. Social engineering has been used in many other dictatorships, including Nazi Germany and Maoist China. 20th century social engineering emerged out of the revolutionary new theories in the field of psychology, which began in the world's first psychological laboratory at Leipzig University in Germany, established by the father of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, in 1875. Wundt mentored over 100 graduate students at Leipzig, some of whom went on to become very prominent themselves. In his book, The Leipzig Connection, Paolo Leone describes Leipzig as, quote, a flourishing center of culture and the sciences, each of its universities a magnet for the ambitious intellectual youth of Europe and the United States, unquote. Adding that, Wundt's thesis laid the philosophical basis for the principles of conditioning later developed by Pavlov, who studied physiology in Leipzig in 1884, 5 years after Wundt had inaugurated his laboratory there, and American behavioral psychologists such as Watson and Skinner for lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy, for schools oriented more towards the socialization of the child than toward the development of intellect. The list of Wundt's students is a who's who of early European and American psychologists. In succeeding years, one could go to almost any major European or American university and study the new psychology with a professor who had received his PhD directly from Wundt at Leipzig, unquote. Out of this ferment emerged the underlying premise that human behavior could not only be predicted, but it could also be shaped preemptively. Irrespective of individual tendencies or innate talents, experiential data could be fed to young nervous systems to modify their behavior and produce model citizens, greatly facilitating the building of a utopia, a perfect society. Compulsory schools were thus established for this purpose, where the pedagogy put emphasis on socialization as opposed to scholastics and eliciting specific responses deemed desirable while subduing responses deemed undesirable. Teachers learned this new pedagogy at places like the Rockefeller Endowed Teachers College, which moved to Columbia University in New York in 1893, where it exploded in both size and scope, becoming the nation's first, largest, and most comprehensive graduate school of education, health, and psychology. This new obsession with behavior modification was also the source of growing concern for the rising tide of totalitarianism around the world and became the very basis of classic cautionary tales like Huxley's Brave New World and Orwell's 1984. In 1962, Huxley spoke at UC Berkeley, describing what he called the final revolution, explicitly alluding to the Pavlovian method, which makes people vulnerable to suggestion, and to a historical evolution in the methods of what he calls the controlling oligarchy, for whom the use of brute force is replaced by getting people to willingly tolerate their servitude, and eventually even to love it, which he refers to as the final or ultimate revolution. Today, with computer technology, AI, and social media, Huxley's observations are more relevant than ever. Also highlighting Huxley's talk at Berkeley was his allusion to the suggestibility studies, which had revealed that about 20% of humans are extremely suggestible, while another 20% are the opposite, with about 60% in the middle who are moderately suggestible. Also very interesting was Huxley's allusion to the fact that very similar percentages have also been found to apply in arenas outside of susceptibility to suggestion, specifically susceptibility to placebo effect and susceptibility to hypnosis.
The nature of the ultimate revolution with which we are now faced is precisely this, that we are in process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and presumably always will exist, to get people actually to love their servitude. And that there seems to be a general movement in the direction of this kind of ultimate revolution, this method of control by which people can be made to enjoy a state of affairs which, by any decent standard, they ought not to enjoy. Pavlov, after all, made some extremely profound observations, both on animals and on human beings. And he found, among other things, that conditioning techniques applied to animals or humans in a state either of psychological or physical stress sank in, so to say, very deeply into the mind-body of the creature and were extremely difficult to get rid of, that they seem to be embedded more deeply than other forms of conditioning. In this context, I would like to mention the extremely interesting chapters in Dr. William Sargent's Battle for the Mind, where he points out how intuitively some of the great religious teachers, leaders of the past, hit on the Pavlovian method. He speaks specifically of Wesley's method of producing conversions, which were essentially based upon a technique of heightening psychological stress to the limit by talking about hellfire, and so making people extremely vulnerable to suggestion. We now know the reason why these techniques worked, and there is no doubt at all that we can, if we want to, carry them much further than was possible in the past. And of course, in the recent history of brainwashing, both as applied to prisoners of war and to the lower personnel within the Communist Party in China, we see that the Pavlovian methods have been applied systematically and evidently with extraordinary efficacy. I mean, I think there can be no doubt that by the application of these methods, a very large army of totally devoted people has been created. The conditioning has been driven in, so to say, by kind of psychological iontophoresis into the very depth of the people's being, and has got so deep that it's very difficult for it ever to be rooted out. And these methods, I think, are a real refinement on the older methods of terror, because they combine methods of terror with methods of acceptance. Well, then we come to the consideration of other techniques, of non-terroristic techniques for inducing consent and for inducing people to love their servitude. First of all, there are the methods connected with straight suggestion and hypnosis. I think we know much more about this subject than was known in the past. People, of course, have always known about suggestion, and although they didn't know the word hypnosis, they certainly practiced it. But we now, I think, know pretty clearly the sort of statistical structure of a population in regard to its suggestibility. It's very interesting when you look at the findings in different fields. I mean, in the field of hypnosis, in the field of administering placebos, for example, in the field of general suggestion in states of drowsiness or of light sleep, you will find the same sorts of orders of magnitude continually cropping up. You will find, for example, that the experienced hypnotists will tell one that the percentage of people who can be hypnotized with the utmost facility, just like that, is about 20%. That about a corresponding number at the other end of the scale are very, very difficult or almost impossible to hypnotize, and that in between there lies a large mass of people who can, with more or less difficulty, be hypnotized, that they can gradually be, if you work hard enough at it, be got into the hypnotic state. And in the same way, the same sort of figures crop up again, for example, in relation to the administration of placebos. A big experiment was carried out 3 or 4 years ago in the General Hospital in Boston on post-operative cases. And about 20% of those who went through the experiment, about 20% of them got just as much relief from the distilled water as from the morphia. About 20% got no relief from the distilled water, and in between were those who got some relief or got relief occasionally. So here again we see the same sort of distribution. And I suspect also that it would not be at all difficult to recognize in very early childhood who were those who were extremely suggestible, who were those who were extremely unsuggestible, and who were those who occupied the intermediate space. Quite clearly, if everybody were extremely unsuggestible, organized society would be quite impossible. And if everybody were extremely suggestible, then dictatorship would be absolutely inevitable. I mean, it's very fortunate we have people who are moderately suggestible in the majority. But once given the fact that there are these 20% of highly suggestible people, it becomes quite clear that this is a matter of enormous political importance. For example, any demagogue who is able to get hold of a large number of these 20% of suggestible people and to organize them is really in a position to overthrow any government in any country. This differential suggestibility, this susceptibility to hypnosis, I do think is something which has to be considered very carefully in relation to any kind of thought about democratic government. I mean, if there are 20% of the people who can really be suggested into believing almost anything, as evidently they can be, then we have to take extremely careful steps to prevent the rise of demagogues.
The very year Huxley made this speech, in 1962, the Milgram experiments at Yale University ended, which studied the degree to which participants would obey authority figures instructing them to perform acts which conflicted with their conscience. And it was a decade after the Asch conformity experiments at Swarthmore College, which studied the degree to which individuals yielded to peer pressure and a majority group opinion. Huxley's concern is understandable, given that he lived through not only the discovery of revolutionary new methods in the field of psychology, but also their application in totalitarian states. He also witnessed the birth of public relations and the work of its founding fathers, including Freud's nephew Ed Bernays, who authored aptly named books like Crystallizing Public Opinion in 1923, Propaganda in 1928, and Engineering of Consent in 1947. He witnessed many of the now infamous PR campaigns Bernays conducted for prominent economic interests like Procter & Gamble, the American Tobacco Company, General Electric, and Woodrow Wilson's Department of War. He no doubt saw the many Bernaysian slogans like Torches of Freedom, which was used in the late 1920s to convince women to associate smoking cigarettes with women's rights and the good life. He had also witnessed Bernays' work on behalf of United Fruit Company, operating in Guatemala and facilitating the overthrow of the democratically elected Guatemalan government in 1954. Writing in 1951, noted philosopher and Nobel laureate Bertrand Russell wrote the following in his book, The Impact of Science on Society. Quote, "I think the subject will be of most importance politically is mass psychology. Its importance has been enormously increased by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. Of these, the most influential is what's called education. Religion plays a part, though a diminishing one. The press, the cinema, and the radio play an increasing part. It may be hoped that in time, anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if he can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with money and equipment. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a morbid taste for eccentricity. It is for future scientists to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black, and how much less it would cost to make them believe it is dark gray." Unquote. That same year, Hannah Arendt, who was one of the most influential political theorists of the 20th century, known for her attempts to explain how ordinary people become involved in totalitarian systems, noted the following in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Quote, "Mass propaganda discovered that its audience was ready at all times to believe the worst, no matter how absurd, and did not particularly object to being deceived because it held every statement to be a lie anyhow. The totalitarian mass leaders based their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that, under such conditions, one could make people believe the most fantastic statements on one day and trust if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism. Instead of deserting the leaders who had lied to them, they would protest that they had known all along that the statement was a lie and would admire the leaders for their superior tactical cleverness. The aim of totalitarian education has never been to instill convictions, but to destroy the capacity to form any. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the dedicated communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists." Unquote. By 1952, what was happening in American schools had gotten significant enough that it was the focus of a congressional investigation, the Reece Committee, which looked into the tax-exempt foundations of the industrial giants of that time, notably Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford, to determine if they were using their grant-making power and vast wealth to influence the American education system. Norman Dodd, the lead investigator, presented this congressional committee's findings in the Dodd Report, which stated that during the period of 1933 to 1936, a revolutionary change took place which, quote, "could not have occurred peacefully or with the consent of the majority unless education in the United States had been prepared in advance to endorse it," unquote. Primarily because this revolution opposed American traditions and its independent esprit and promoted instead internationalism, collectivism, and moral relativism. The Dodd Report, issued on April 29, 1954, described the effects the committee concluded the tax-exempt foundations were having in America, which included, quote, "directing education in the United States towards an international viewpoint and discrediting the traditions to which it was formally dedicated, decreasing the dependency of education upon the resources of the local community and freeing it from many of the natural safeguards inherent in this American tradition, changing both school and college curricula to the point where they sometimes denied the principles underlying the American way of life," unquote. Ultimately, the committee failed to bring charges, and although the issue of the subversive activities of tax-exempt foundations had become a hot topic, it had also been highly politicized, helping to garner just as much support for the foundations as there was opposition, which obfuscated what should have been a slam dunk, as politicization often does. Dodd describes all this in an interview shortly before his death in 1987. For more on this, see the link in the description below entitled Norman Dodd on What Happened to the Reece Committee, where he describes exactly what the committee unearthed from the Carnegie Endowment's own board meeting minutes, which included the stated aim of, quote, "building our own stable of historians," unquote. What sorts of people, one has to wonder, would even want to build their own stable of historians? Also writing in the 1950s, Dutch-American doctor of medicine and psychoanalyst Joost Meerloo analyzed brainwashing techniques and thought control in totalitarian systems in his best-known book, Rape of the Mind. Quote, "Ready-made opinions can be distributed day by day through press, radio, and so on, again and again, till they reach the nerve cell and implant a fixed pattern of thought in the brain. Consequently, guided public opinion is the result, according to Pavlovian theoreticians, of good propaganda technique, and the polls a verification of the temporary successful action of the Pavlovian machinations on the mind. The Pavlovian strategy in public relations has people conditioned more and more to ask themselves, what do other people think? As a result, a common delusion is created. People are incited to think what other people think, and thus public opinion may mushroom into a mass prejudice. Pavlov formulated his findings into a general rule in which the speed of learning positively correlated with quiet isolation. The totalitarians have followed this rule. They know they can condition their political victims most quickly if they're kept in isolation. In totalitarian technique of thought control, the same isolation applied to the individual is also applied to groups of people. This is the reason the civilian populations of the totalitarian countries are not permitted to travel freely and are kept away from mental and political contamination. Such is the Pavlovian device. Repeat mechanically your assumptions and suggestions. Diminish the opportunity of communicating dissent and opposition. Expressed in psychoanalytic terms, through daily propagandistic noise backed up by forceful verbal cues, people can more and more be forced to identify with the powerful noisemaker. Big Brother's voice resounds in all the little brothers." Unquote. While it is admittedly tempting to ignore all this as history that has long since become irrelevant, and that dictatorship or communism could never come to America, it seems prudent to ask ourselves how many totalitarian dictators we can think of that did not emerge amid thunderous applause. It's also helpful to recall who it was that brought totalitarian dictatorships to Stalinist Russia and Maoist China.
Thanks to the patronage and the interest of various international business people, a group of academic social engineers was able to visit mainland China in the first 3 decades of the 20th century and live there as John Dewey lived in post-revolutionary China for 2 years. In China, these men could test pedagogical theory on a docile and bewildered population which had recently lost its ancient form of governance. Important school superintendents were in on this work, although the general public is in the dark about it to this day. For example, I'd like you to listen to Dr. H.B. Wilson, superintendent of the Topeka schools, writing in his book, which absolutely nobody read or would want to read. It's called Motivation of Schoolwork. He wrote it in 1916, but this one paragraph was worth the agony of reading his whole book. The introduction of the American school into the Orient has broken up 40 centuries of tradition. It has given us a new China and new Japan, and is working marked progress in Turkey and the Philippines. The schools are in a position to determine the lines of progress. The Chinese Revolution was Western-inspired and Western-financed, just as the Russian Revolution soon was to be. And it placed that nation in a favorable state of disintegration for laboratory testing of pedagogical mind alteration technology. Out of this ferment rose a Chinese tracking practice built on the ancient habit of character references, modernized and bureaucratized. It's called in China the Dangan. It is a continuous, lifelong personnel file exposing a student's intimate history from birth through schooling and then through life. The Dangan constitutes a comprehensive overthrow of privacy, and today nobody works in China without a Dangan. By the mid-1960s, preliminary work on an American Dangan was taking place in schools as information reservoirs attached to schooling began to store personal data about individual children. A new class of expert, like Ralph Tyler of the Carnegie Foundation, began to urge the collection of data and its unification in computer code to enhance cross-referencing with all the other data banks. By 1971, psychologists in the pay of government and private foundations were justifying surreptitious data gathering from children as the moral right of institutions. The real purpose of modern schooling was announced by Edward Ross of the University of Wisconsin Ross is generally considered one of the three founders of the 20th century discipline called sociology, and in a book bluntly called Social Control, Ross wrote, I'll quote directly, "Plans are underway to replace family, church, and community with propaganda, education," he meant schooling, "and mass media. People," he informed his readers, "are only little plastic lumps of dough."
So in 2020, when the many respected and in some cases highly published members of the medical and scientific community put their names, faces, and reputations and careers on the line and questioned authorities' pandemic response in America, the skids were well greased. The telltale sign was the emotional tone in the discourse that looks to silence dissent instead of engaging with it. The media echo chamber assumed the predictable one disease, one cause, one new miracle drug posturing, shaming physicians who tried to treat people with drugs already in existence when they were supposed to wait it out for the pharmaceutical high priests on white horses to arrive with their latest silver bullet. If the media wasn't shaming the pushback from the medical community, it was censoring it. And when dissenting voices tried to take to social media to get their message out, the major platforms all responded on cue and in unison with more censorship. In lockstep came the legal threat of having one's license suspended or revoked, or being fired outright. As any psychologist could have predicted, the members of the medical community who were less susceptible to suggestion, even in the face of such punishment, were unlikely to sit around and watch people suffer and die when there were already drugs available to ameliorate this. Thanks to the mass media messaging that had social conditioning written all over it, many bought the idea that those who questioned the authorities' pandemic response like attention so much, or were making so much money, that it was worth it to them to risk the careers and reputations they had spent decades building. In 1929, when he was a 25-year-old graduate student, B.F. Skinner attended a lecture at Harvard Medical School given by Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. Skinner wrote about this occasion in his autobiography, which also contained many other allusions to the man who had influenced his thinking so much. Here's an excerpt. Quote, "I heard Pavlov's presidential address in German, but did not try to shake his hand. I did get his autograph. A photographer was taking orders for a portrait and had asked Pavlov to write his name on a slip of paper so that his signature could appear on each print. I offered to buy a copy if I could have the slip of paper when the photographer was through with it, and he sent it to me." Unquote. In 1971, B.F. Skinner's book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, was published. In it, Skinner argues that free will was hindering the creating of a perfect society, a utopia, and that scientific methods to modify behavior, or what he called cultural engineering, were necessary to complete the task. I don't know if Skinner was right, but I'm fairly certain that someone with a lot of money and power liked his idea. I only wish I could believe their conception of what constitutes a utopia is a sound one.